Right on. Well, it's 10 o'clock, so we're going to get started here right away. My name is Karina Lepp, and I work with the Manitoba canola growers here in Rivers, Manitoba. Thank you again so much for joining us this morning. We have a really full hour, so we're going to get right into it. As I mentioned before, in the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A box, and you can type your questions in there, and we'll answer them throughout the presentation. As well, this presentation will allow you to obtain your CEU credits, and those will be shown at the end of each of the presentations. So thank you so much for joining us. Right now, I'd like to turn it over to Jay Whetter, who is our moderator for today. Jay works with the Canola Council of Canada and is also the editor of Canola Digest. So welcome, Jay.
Thanks, Karina. Hi, everybody. All right, just a quick rundown on how it's going to go today. So we're going to have Tom speak first for 15 or 20 minutes, and then Ian will follow for another 15 or 20, hopefully closer to 15. And then we'll do a Q&A for 20 minutes or so, and then Tom and Ian will do a quick wrap up, and that'll be that. I think Leanne and Karina already noted that this is going to be recorded, so you can watch it again. And I also plan to make it into a Canola Watch podcast as well. All right, Tom Wolf. Tom is a spray application specialist and a partner at Agrimetrics Research and Training based in Saskatoon. He grew up on a farm in Manitoba and studied agriculture at the University of Manitoba and the Ohio State University. Tom has over 30 years research experience in spray technology, including work on coverage, efficacy, sprayer cleanout, and more. With Jason DeVoe, Tom hosts and writes for the world's #1 sprayer website, sprayers101.com. And he is a past president and fellow of the Canadian Weed Science Society. Tom, take it away.
Well, thank you, Jay. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this morning. We are going to spend the next 15 minutes just talking about some last-minute pointers on spraying. We recognize that this is not the time for big projects. It's the time to be in the field, and I just wanted to maybe share some of the highlights of what I would recommend for that. I am just quickly going to share my screen. Bear with me, and we will get started. Here we go. All right, thank you for to the Manitoba canola growers for organizing this little webinar. They are in fact a sponsor of our website, sprayers101.com. It's a free website. Some of the things I'm going to say here today are found on that website if you want to follow up. So here's point number one. I guess for me, it has always been about doing the best possible job. And that often means in spraying that you have the right spray quality. We are using more diverse modes of action in our operations than ever before. We're doing more tank mixing. Some of this is because of resistance management. And many of these products that we're applying do have very specific needs in terms of spray quality. So we're just going to quickly review what those needs are. And I just want you to do a mental check and make sure you can cover those bases. Okay, so some of what I'm going to say does depend on the mode of action. That's the first column right over here. Mode of action group, sorry, first column here. And we're all familiar with these numbers. System. These modes of action are, they have a certain movement associated with them in the plant. They're either systemic or contact. The low numbers are typically systemic, with the exception of group 6, and then the higher numbers are typically contact. So that's one bit of a guideline to use. We're also concerned about the kind of target that we have. And grassy herbicides, grassy weeds typically present a more challenging target, particularly for the larger drops. They're more vertical, they're typically difficult to wet, they're often small. Often we're encouraged to apply early for early weed removal. Those are all things to consider. So we basically go down the list and say, okay, what are we targeting with these modes of action? And remember, consider the fact that there's often a tank mix involved that will then purposely try to target both of those. The third consideration, or I guess fourth consideration, fourth column, is sort of the the site of uptake. Is it a foliar uptake or a soil applied uptake? Some of these modes of action have more than one. Some of them predominate in one. It depends on the specific product. So you do have to do your research. And then when we consider all of these things, we then assign a spray quality that we think will work. For the most part, the more difficult targets, grasses, will always default to a medium to coarse spray quality. If we get any coarser than that, we may have some loss of performance, particularly when conditions are tougher, harder to kill situations. When we have a broadleaf target, it's an easy target essentially, and we can go coarse, very coarse, and even extremely coarse in some cases without any loss of performance. Very surprising how coarse you actually can go. Of course, it depends on the water volume, and that's another consideration. But when we have basically both group one or grass and broadleaf weeds, we will always default to the most limiting factor, and that is going to be the grass. So if you have a tank mix that it contains a grass killer, you are going to need to be using a medium to coarse spray, not coarser than that. And another little additional help to that is, of course, to make sure you have enough water. Water is a very good way of allowing you to use coarser sprays. So for example, if it is windy and you do want to go a little coarser to protect yourself because you do have a problem tank mix component that might harm your downwind off-target area, by all means, add some water to that tank and allow yourself to go a little coarser to protect that area. Of course, some of the new to us modes of action, the groups 14 and 15 down here that are often tank mixed earlier in the year for resistance management, for burn off in some cases, will default back to the medium to coarse spray. So we do have to have more than one nozzle in our arsenal. And we do want to just quickly go through sort of a small exercise that we can use to help us. What I've done here is I've listed a particular low drift nozzle. It's an air-induced nozzle. I'm just going to make an assumption that we are going 10 gallons per acre, and that's sort of the blue outline here. Now that's gallons per acre in the top row, and then the column underneath here is miles per hour. If we're targeting an average travel speed, and there's no judgment here, I'm just going to give you a couple of scenarios of say 14 to 15 miles per hour. You would likely be using the 04 nozzle size, and you'd want to run it at a pressure that gives you the coarse to medium spray qualities, for example, for Liberty, important herbicide and canola contact product. That would give you about a 14 or so mile per hour travel speed. But let's say just an assumption that it is a wetter year. We have had some rain now. It's by no means wet yet. But let's assume that your target travel speed just simply isn't possible. It's a little too soft. Maybe you're having a hard time with that speed. You would then maybe slow down to 10 or 11 miles per hour. That really means that you should be going to a smaller nozzle in that situation. If you were to push this 04 to a lower pressure, 30 or 40 PSI, you would be venturing into the very coarse spray quality for this particular nozzle, and that will not give you the coverage that you want for this product. So by all means, be prepared to go to a smaller nozzle for those situations. And just the opposite is also true if it isn't a dry and hard surface and you can go faster. Don't push the 04 to 80 or 90 PSI to achieve those faster travel speeds, because your spray will become simply too drift prone. The extra coverage you might get from that medium spray is not, isn't going to be noticeable in the field. You will still want to be coarse to medium. That sort of ballpark covers all the bases. So just be prepared to, and if you encounter a condition you weren't anticipating, that you do have the right nozzle to compensate for that. So that's a very important thing. We have lots of material on which nozzle is the right one for these kinds of works on Spurs 101. By all means, look it up. It's got a great search engine. Remember, I guess the last comment I would make is that your speedometer should be your pressure gauge. So keep an eye on the gauge and go at the speed that gives you the pressure that gives you the spray quality. That's really what we're hoping to achieve here. Okay, point number 2. Now is the time to plan your winter projects. And I know this is a hard lesson which is coming out of it, but this is not the time to start making changes to your sprayer. The time has passed, it's time to spray. But this is the time to take note of things that are happening, take time to account for your time. And the best tool really is, a notepad, a stopwatch, and really just do take the time. It's a hard thing to do. I know you're busy doing other things, but even if it's just the marker on the glass of the sprayer cab, I'm a notorious timekeeper. I'm always timing myself how long it takes me to get to my office, for example, or to go from A to B that I'm planning to do in the future. We always underestimate how long it takes to do things because we don't start measuring at the right time. So I've made a little worksheet that, I just made it up. It's chronological, but these are the kinds of things that matter. I'm going to assume that it's a good spray day today. Are you fueling up on a good spray day? You didn't fuel up when you came home last night. That's 10 or 15 minutes you'll never get back. Lubing, anything like that. Are you loading your tender, your pickup truck? Shouldn't you be spraying? Are you unsure about some of the specifics of the label you're covering? You're cutting into the spray time. Tender trucks, even things like filling the tender truck. If you have a tender system and it works, but it's empty and it has to go home, that's an hour gone. I have a customer who uses a large reservoir tank on his yard with a 20 horse 5-inch pump that does 1,000 gallons a minute. He fills his entire tender in about 10 minutes. And so the sprayer doesn't wait. So those are the kinds of things we just really want to know. I've got a customer who has basically made an art form out of loading the sprayer onto the flatbed with every hand movement, basically something useful. He's loaded and ready to go with his towing his sprayer out there in just a few minutes, and it's a safe operation. So just sort of take account of those things. At the end, filling sprayer is probably the big one. Cleaning the sprayer is a big one. Cleaning filters, anything like that, flushing. I'd be curious to see what you come up with. Express that as a proportion of the total time spent, or maybe the total time spraying, which is very important. Okay, we've just got just a few minutes left, and I want to maybe just highlight some of the things I'm seeing. I mean, this is just a classic tender setup. Nothing too special about it, but it's a nice design. It's clean. We are more, everyone that's doing a fast fill is inducting. We can do up to 150 liters a minute on a good, well-designed inductor. We do sometimes still use product pumps, but they will possibly slow you down. A hose reel for 3-inch hoses is essential. These things, when wet, when full, are extremely heavy. And if you drain them on the site, then you basically make a mess. Some people purge them with air. Some people will actually have a pump that can reverse and draw them empty. Anything to help you with that pays huge dividends. And of course, local businesses. This is the fiber tender system, the fiber dash made in Crystal City in southern Manitoba. It's an excellent system, very well designed. It's got some very cool innovations that no one else has, so do consider that one. Little changes that you might consider making. We've talked about this for the future. The recirculating boom saves product and saves time from priming. You can prime without spraying. How much time are you spending priming? Are you sure your boom is full of product? Continuous cleaning. How much time are you spending cleaning? Are you sure the tank's clean? Those are difficult questions to answer, but the people that have put these continuous rinse systems in with the second pump that just pumps water from the clean water tank to the washdown nozzles allows you to spray at the same time are saving tons of time. You basically are diluting and cleaning out the residual volume in your tank in just 5 minutes. And then from that point on, you can now move and go ahead and do the other stuff, cleaning boomants, filters, anything else that might require cleaning. A little innovation, the AccuVolume right here. This is a little load cell on the 4830 sump here that's just plumbed into a T. Beautiful system that tells you the nearest gallon, what's left in your tank. It's a time saver. And it has a little readout to the nearest gallon. So, I consider these little innovations, these little changes very important. And the last tip that I want to give you is to, in fact, even if you're not spraying dicamba on an XtendiMax or an Extend variety, consider getting an ultra coarse nozzle nonetheless, because it gets you out of a bind. I call it my get out of jail free nozzle. If you are somewhere far from home and you're committed to doing that field, but the winds are becoming questionable, but there's weather coming in, and you don't know when you're going to get back to that field, but you don't feel good about continuing, put one of these nozzles on and continue. They will reduce drift by a huge amount. They're virtually as close to drift free as we can get. Yes, there is a loss of coverage, absolutely. But perhaps in that last tank, you can make up for that with some more water. The efficacy loss may not be noticeable, and it may be small compared to your yield loss if you don't get back to that field in the next several days, because things do happen fast. So here's just in closing, sort of a almost 10 nozzles actually that you should consider. These are in alphabetical order. The Greenleaf Soft Drop is a nozzle that is made for PWM. It is made by Greenleaf. It's an Agritop product from Germany. It's extremely coarse to ultra coarse, works at reasonable pressures, and will get the job done. Greenleaf also makes dicamba specific air induced nozzles, not for pulsing, a wide variety of sizes available. And these are very coarse to ultra coarse. They all even made one for their twin nozzle. So they have 3 products that'll get you out of a bind. They're all labeled as dicamba specific products. Hypro has recently released a new nozzle called the Ultra Low Drift Max. It is air induced. It is okayed for pulse width modulation. Though it comes in all the popular sizes and pressures. Extremely coarse to ultra coarse. In fact, it's the coarsest nozzle I've ever seen. It has a super wide fan angle, so it works well even at lower pressures should that ever be necessary. A little frightening, but it will do the coverage. The TJet TTI is kind of the granddaddy of the dicamba nozzles, well proven, well used. It's air induced. TJet has okayed this nozzle for PWM as well. Comes in all the sizes you could ever need. They also have a dual fan version of this. Not sure if that's absolutely necessary. Slightly smaller size selection, also okayed for PWM, even though it's air induced. And a new one, they've made a nozzle. They designed a nozzle for PWM. It's again a twin nozzle. Again, it's a dicamba spray quality. Comes in all the sizes you could possibly want. It is a very clever design. Lastly, Wilger, sort of the, I guess, the standard bearer of pulse width modulation nozzles, the first to the party, and the largest selection of PWM compatible nozzles, largely a case specific product because case puts the Wilger nozzle bodies on in the factory, but easy to adapt to any TJet lug system. A huge size selection available in that Wilger line. So these nozzles will get you out of a bind, will let you finish the job. And that is, those are my 3 main tips for last minute considerations prior to hitting the field. Jay, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. I'm sure there's lots of questions coming in. So like Karina noted, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Put your questions into there. I've got a few saved up, Tom, but those ideas on saving time by being prepared so you're ready to spray when those good spray hours and days come along, that's great. Okay, Ian Epp. Ian Epp is an agronomy specialist with the Canola Council of Canada, colleague of mine. Ian was raised on a family grain farm near Blaine Lake, Saskatchewan, and he still lives there, or he lives there again with his young family. And he farms as well as working for the Canola Council. Ian graduated from the University of Saskatchewan with the Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, majoring in agronomy. And he's been the Canola Council's weed management lead, and he assists in public affairs regarding pesticides. Ian.
You can hear me, Jay?
You betcha.
Excellent. All right. So kind of similar to jumping off what Tom was talking about, I'm going to be talking about kind of everything we need to do right now for spraying. Weeds and pesticides are a bit of a passion of mine. I could probably spend an hour talking about herbicide resistance, and I love sitting down with growers and kind of crafting how we're going to do weed management, integrated weed management, different tools, tips, things we can add in. But now's not the time. The seed's in the ground and the weeds are growing, and we need to make sure we control them. And then, so I'll give you a couple different things we need to really be thinking about right now. Maybe these are just a bit of a refresher. I know when I'm not working for the Canola Council, I do a little bit of farming part-time. And so some of these things are things that I realize going through the growing season every year. There's something like, oh yeah, I should have done that. I remembered I left myself a note from last year in the sprayer cab all winter that said, remember to check this, because this was causing you grief before you get to the field and you go, what the heck's going on here? So well, a few things. Like Jay said, I'm one of the agronomy specialists for the Canola Council. I'm assuming this being a Manitoba canola growers webinar that many of you are in Manitoba. So if you are looking for more weed advice or just canola advice in general, Justine and Nate are your local, and Warren a little bit if you're up in the north a little bit there, are your Manitoba growers, or reach out to me if you have a weed or pesticide related question. Yeah, so I said, we're talking about things to think about before you hit the sprayer, before we get into the field, before we get to here, or maybe as you're doing this, as you get your auto steer set up, what are the things we need to be double checking? What are the things we need to be doing? This was me learning a new sprayer this year. I've been spraying for a long time. We had the same sprayer for a lot of years. It was good, it was reliable. I could tell you the ins and outs. I could tell you exactly which filter I would check first if I had this problem or that. But we changed sprayers, and that was good for many reasons. But learning a new sprayer has just reminded me the challenges of rinsing, checking out how to plumb. Is it working right? Am I getting the right pressure? A lot of those things Tom was talking about are a good refresher for me, because it's been a bit of a learning curve to just making sure a new sprayer is actually doing what the monitor says and what I actually want it to do in the field. So step one, this kind of jumps off what Tom was talking about, but more on the agronomic side, is your sprayer clean? If this was 20 years ago, we're just coming out of our pre-burn, we would have sprayed straight glyphosate on everything. Glyphosate's a pretty easy rinse out, and we'd be off to the races. But now, hopefully, if you've been doing some planning in winter, you probably had 2 or 3 other modes of action alongside glyphosate to improve weed control, maybe some residual control, herbicide resistance. You had a group 14, maybe you had a group 2, depending on what crop. And now double checking that your sprayer is clean coming into canola. So this, the pictures you see here are the exact case we want to avoid. This is group 2 damage on some Liberty Link canola. So the grower had been spraying a number of tank mix partners in their pre-burn, had no issues, no residual, things looked good. Went to spray their first tank of Liberty, and Liberty, on top of being a widespread canola herbicide, is very good at scrubbing out certain other herbicides from your tank. So if you've done a medium job to cleaning your sprayer but haven't quite got everything cleaned out, you might have issues. So this is Frontline that was used ahead of some cereals, and then Liberty popped it out of the tank, and now we have pretty clear cases. And this was spread over 500 or 600 acres, just as boom ends, and as it was slowly taken out of the sprayer and kind of pooled in a few different areas. So again, I hate these situations. They're tough to go to. There's not a lot we can do at this point, but double checking that, especially before spraying Liberty, or as you make that big transition from your pre-burn into your in-crop, and especially Liberty, we do a really good job recognizing that Liberty will find the things that if we don't find them first. And again, Sprayers 101's a really good, or the Canola Council has some websites if you want more details on what that looks like. I'm not going to go into the details, but before you hit the sprayer next time, make sure, is the sprayer clean? If you don't do a lot of good record keeping, I would recommend that list of fields, what products I used, and sometimes I put a little note. I put a little star. I have a book that sits in our sprayer, and it's got a little note, and I star the ones that, oh yeah, I had a group 2 here that I'm concerned. I want to make sure I do an extra good rinse, or I'm going to need to buy some ammonia or something extra to make sure my sprayer is clean. So looking back through your records, have you sprayed anything? Again, this is one from my farm from last year. I talk about sprayers a lot, and normally I try to do exactly what I talk about, but I sprayed a product. It was an all-in-one product, and I've had gumming like I've never had before. So again, learning where to check your sprayer, what are all the hang-ups. This was not a fun day. This was about 80 acres into spraying a product that was new to me, and everything was on label. It was all good, except, as you can see here, I have never had so much gumming in my sprayer in my life. So again, these things happen, but have this happened in the past? Is your sprayer clean? Where is this going to hang up? Having a bad gumming like this really showed me a few extra areas to maybe pay closer attention to in my sprayer. Another thing, I just thought I should mention this, as we're looking at, we've been dry across the prairies. We were a bit dry last fall, dry this spring. I've had a number of calls on herbicide residue. So, Odyssey showing up in this year's canola, which maybe accidents happened, or just other products that normally we get away with, but we've been so dry. Are we going to have herbicide carryover? And are we going to have, like we said, if we didn't clean out our sprayer quite good, are we going to get some group 2 symptoms showing up from residue? I just want to point out that with all the cold frosts that cold can show purpling. The picture you see here is just cold on canola. That'll be temporary. That should disappear fairly quickly. But as you're out scouting for frost damage, maybe looking, is this herbicide damage? What I recommend there, if you see purpling like this, it's generally more general to the plant. It's not so much on the growing point as a group 2 injury, but I would put a little pin flag or something at that plant. And if you come back 48 hours later and the purpling's all gone, it was probably just cold weather. Canola really doesn't like going from +20 down to even +1 or 2. Not a frost damage issue, but you're going to get purpling like this. You can also get some sulfur damage or sulfur deficiency symptoms. Usually you're not going to see that quite this early, but just not all purpling is group 2 damage, though in some cases, unfortunately, that is what happens. So the kind of the step of thing, you've cleaned your sprayer. Now I'd like you really want to emphasize getting out in the field and actually scouting. There's nothing that replaces the boots in the field. Now is a really critical time to be scouting, not just for weeds, flea beetles, frost damage, stand establishment in general. This is a really critical time for canola. But while you're out there, we're looking at weeds in the field. Make sure you get a good record of what's in your field. Is the weed pressure heavy, light, not so bad? And again, what species are out there? Species can change a lot year to year. I know for those of you that have been farming for a while, you're probably experts on what the top couple weeds are in individual fields. But are they bigger this year? Are they smaller? This is going to tie into make sure we're doing a really good job with when we spray. In canola, we're fortunate that for a lot of our canola, we have the ability to spray 2 applications. But I always think let's do the first one right. Let's get in there early. Let's do it right. And if we need a second one, we can. So let's make sure we're not going back in because we didn't get a great spray application. We have some escapes. So yeah, what weeds are in your field? What are the driver weeds? I like to know what are the top 3 weeds in your fields, both in terms of numbers. What's the biggest weeds in your field? So can I kill the most numerous field ones? That flush of green foxtail that's just everywhere. What's the biggest weeds in my field? What do I got to do to rate? Do I got to add a tank mix partner? And are there any special weeds in there? Kochia that I think might be glyphosate resistant. It's already going to be group 2 resistant. Other herbicide resistant weeds. What do I have to do? Is there a tank? So again, we're not talking big picture weed management. We're talking you're probably going to be spraying later this week. The chemical, maybe I've already chosen the canola. So what's the rate do I need to do? Can I add a tank mix partner? And what else do I need to be scouting for? Is there a patch when I'm scouting that looks kind of weird? There's a patch of a lot of wild oats. I like throwing in pin flags again in the field. Come back 2 weeks after an application. Go, did the plants actually die? Was the rate, the product I used actually correct? And is there a herbicide resistance or something I need to be putting in my records for next year so I can make better decisions in winter? Yeah, so staging these plants is really important. And staging the canola. Again, we have a wide window of application in canola, but spray early. So, key weeds like this, we got a nice flush of cereals coming in on the canola there. The canola looks good, but the cereals are equally big. And then special weeds like cleavers that are hard to control, we have tank mix partners you can add. It's just a matter of, do we actually need that tank mix partner? This is just a good reminder, different canola, different products. We want to be staying on label. And a lot of these products, we have a really wide window of application. You can apply them really late, which is great. But for best yield results, if you want to maximize your yield, we're applying early. And then if we get another flush, the rains, whatever, we can apply a second time. So depending if it's TrueFlex canola or Liberty Link canola, different application timing and windows, just make sure we're on label with those applications, and the earlier, the better. This is my spray early, and if you have to, spray twice. So some years it absolutely makes sense with a late flush of weeds. This year it's been fairly dry. I noticed some of my own fields, the pre-burn worked well. We seeded in, it was powder on top. There has been no weeds. And my canola is not really up yet, but my cereals are pushing 3-leaf and they're actually really clean. But now we've had this rain. I expect a big flush. If I had more weeds, I would probably already been spraying some of my cereals to get in there early. Again, early weed control is for yield. You're waiting for that extra couple of weeds, extra flush. It seems like a good idea, but you're not protecting yield. Those weeds are taking up nutrients, they're taking up moisture. So spray early. And because we're fortunate in canola, we can always spray that second application if we need to. This is a really old slide, but there's not a newer one, but this is long-term work at the U of S. Earlier you spray, the more is for yield protection. Later you get cosmetic weed seed prevention. There's good reasons to spray late, but that first pass has to come on early, especially if we have weeds escaping our pre-burn. That's a key part of scouting. If we have winter annuals that we didn't get the right rate of glyphosate on, or kochia plants that emerge just at the time of seeding, those kind of things, we got to be getting in there to spray early, especially when moisture is a limiting factor. And I guess kind of the third point that I'd like to talk about a little bit is the market access side. So instead of, in addition to doing agronomy work, I'm spending quite a bit of time working on market access issues for canola. So, and that's kind of a two-way street of making sure growers, as growers, have access to the products we need to do the weed control or to do pesticide applications. That's really key. But then making sure that the residues, the intervals, all of that stuff that's coming out, the products we produce meet expectations, right? Because we export 90% of our canola. That's really important to us. We got to make sure we're on label. So if you have questions about that, spraytoswath.ca or keepitclean.ca, lots of information. The key thing here is, as you're going and you're applying your products, is making sure you're on the label, right? And what's the rates? I quite often make myself a cheat sheet of, here's the in-crop products I'm going to spray. Here is the earliest and latest I can spray it, and here is the lowest and the highest rate. Just kind of those easy things. I can figure out the mixing and I can adjust those rates in that depending on the weeds and my scouting. But just a quick reminder of, I can bump it up, but here's how far I can go. We want to be on label with those. Otherwise, we might have residue issues, other issues that are going to cause us problems as we go to market our grain. So in canola, we don't have any major pesticides of concern, pesticides that are registered, but you can't spray, because if you look at those grain declarations, you're going to have problems. We're very fortunate right now to be in a bit of a sweet spot, but this is all, we have to be on the label, right? That the products that come on are on label but have issues. We have none of those right now, but we need to be on label with our applications. So again, the right rate, the right timing, and then pre-harvest interval. If you go back here, that's maybe too many slides back. There's a couple of them, especially some of the group ones. The leaf restriction is not so specific in canola, but again, it's that pre-harvest interval. And again, I think for good weed control, just good agronomy, we need to be applying weeds early, these products early anyway. So normally we don't run into these problems, but especially as we get a little bit later in the season, and again, things happen. The fields get too wet, a product doesn't work, something happens, a sprayer breaks down, you don't follow Tom's advice and you spend all your time loading your sprayer and not actually spraying. We have unfortunate circumstances where we have to apply late, but we're making sure we're on label is really, really important. And that's the other benefit of spraying early, is that should you get delayed, that second application happens a little later. If you're trying to get on early and you get delayed, we're still going to be applying in a reasonable time. So if you're looking for more resources, or once you're out actually in your sprayer, Canola Encyclopedia is a great resource. I've updated a lot of the information on there as far as weed specific things to canola. Canola Watch, if you're not signed up, you probably are because you're on this webinar, but good weekly stuff on what we're seeing in the field as far as weeds control. And then as you're doing a little bit more thinking in winter, if you want a bit of a longer read, the Canola Research Hub is really good access to data. So actual research results coming out, maybe a bit of a longer read, maybe a bit better for winter if you have a little bit longer time, but there's a few canola research or canola weed projects we funded. So a good one to check out. There'll be updates kind of throughout the winter. So if you're looking for some deeper thinking on how to change your weed management program or what's new as far as canola and weeds, a really good resource to check out. Things that pop up are things like this, just showing over the last 50 odd years the amount of weeds, trends in weeds species that have come up, weed species have come down. Kind of interesting to correlate that. Does that correlate with what you're seeing on your farm, and maybe big picture for next year? What do you want to do to combat that? We know that these three weeds are going to become more important. Is there something we can do to do a better job of controlling them? That kind of information. And I think that is it for me. Back to you, Jay.
Hey, right on. Thanks, Ian. Good. All right, so we're into the Q&A. We'll probably take, what do we got here? It's 34 minutes after the hour, so we'll go for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll give you guys each a minute or two to give your last top 3 points. So pop a question into the Q&A if you've got one. I've got a bunch, but of course, I'm not going to monopolize the whole time, but let's kick off with a couple from me. And actually, if there's a ability to participate in the chat or even pop it into the Q&A, I suppose, but I really want to know from the attendees what their municipal well or their water source situation is like. How long does it take to fill 1,000 liters, let's say, minutes per 1,000 liters? I'm wondering if there's differences in from pump to pump across the prairies, and whether that could be an efficiency factor. Maybe driving 5 more minutes down the road is worthwhile if you can get filled in a lot faster time. Tom, have you heard anything about differences between wells and their pump speeds?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, wells are some wells are notoriously slow, and so that's one of the reasons that people are building, basically a tank system on their farm where they can fill up, and then have enough for the day or even the week. Another important part of that is actually the temperature of the water. So it comes out of the ground very cold, and that is a problem for mixing some of our products. And so it creates some issues with also with pulse width modulation valves. So there's a few products that are oily, and it just gets a little more viscous, and the valves tend to stick. So temperature is another reason to do that. Tanks that are darker help. But by all means, a reserve tank on the farm with a large electric pump is a real time saver.
Just got a note here from Jean-Claude, 23 minutes for 1,200 gallons. That's the pump speed at the municipal pump for him. So Ian, I want to jump to you, but so good tips, Tom, on getting the water a little warmer if you can, the black tank or the darker tank, getting that water a little warmer. Ian, that picture you showed of that gum up, nice of you to admit that you made a mistake since you're the expert. That's awesome. So I'm wondering if.
And actually, funny enough, that actually part of my issue was my water was too cold. I have a reserve tank on my yard. It's an old cistern, but it was cold water. And actually, if I had my water warmer, apparently I would have had much less issues. But one of those things that's why actually the first tank was fine, because it was sitting on a black tank. And then I started pumping my cistern water, and that's when I ran into problems. But
really,
always something to learn.
Yeah. So seeing those really badly gummed up filters made me wonder, and Tom, Ian, you go first and then Tom, but this is about efficiency. Is it worthwhile having a full set of extra filters and screens on hand so you don't have to spend any time cleaning, Ian?
Yeah, I quite often have a set. I really don't like running to the city for parts, especially since I do my spraying before and after work. I don't have a lot of business hours to get things. So I quite often have a lot of extra parts kicking around, and extra filters are good. They wear out eventually. They need to be replaced. Every once in a while you break one pulling it out or having issues. So filters are pretty inexpensive. So having a second set around, or sometimes even having a different set of meshes around, if that's causing you grief. Either you're not catching something and my nozzle screens are catching something. I'd rather clean one primary than clean a pile of nozzles. Or the other way, I'm catching things that I don't want to be catching. Yeah, having extra filters around is a cheap insurance in my mind.
Tom?
Yeah, I totally agree. Those are great pointers. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. And indeed, a question I often get is, do we want to go to a nozzle, individual nozzle body filter? And it is again a question of how clean your supply is, whether you have any concerns. And then of course also how large the nozzle is. I mean, typically when it's an 03 size or larger, we typically don't have any plugging issues, so you can really get away without having one there. And even smaller nozzles, if your water is clean, they can just be a reservoir for catching things that would otherwise just go through, and then you have to manage 72 of these tiny little guys, and it's a real time killer.
Okay, so quick question on the nozzle bodies. Is 3 the best? 5? Where would you go with that? Like, how many bases could you cover with a three nozzle body? Are you good for the year?
I would say probably. I mean, so there's two ways of dealing with it. I mean, one way is I think we recognize that we live in an environment where we have 3 basic water volume regimes. The 5 gallon plus or minus for burn off and glyphosate based products, the 10 gallon per acre plus or minus for everything in crop, and then the 15 gallon plus or minus for late season sprays where the canopy becomes an issue. And so you can do that actually with 2 nozzles. I mean, you can do a 5 gallon nozzle and a 10 gallon nozzle for that, but then use your 10 gallon nozzles and just slow it down a little bit for the late season spray because of the crop canopy maybe being a little bit tangly and not wanting to destroy it. Then the 10 gallon tip becomes a 15 gallon tip. Now, the other thing we can do is really use speed and pressure to give us the spray quality for a specific situation. Now, remember, I'm talking about non-PWM systems. If we have a conventional system, just pulling back on the lever 1 or 2 miles per hour gives you 10 to 20 PSI pressure change on average. That means without a huge penalty in speed, you can make things a little coarser when you need to, or finer when you need to. And those are the two main things. Of course, with PWM, you just dial in the pressure that you need right now, and duty cycle, everything takes care of the background. So no speed change is necessary.
Ian, do you want to jump in on that? I've got a question for you back to your gummy filters that I remembered I wanted to ask, but do you want to address that one more time?
Yeah, I think you can do a lot with 2 or 3 nozzles, depending on how picky you are on speed and efficiency. Sometimes having more nozzles are key. I actually had a situation last year where we broke a hayfield, or I didn't break it. I wanted to go no-till into it with a disc drill, so no tillage. But I was spraying this thing, and it was the roughest field that hasn't been touched in years and years. So I actually was spraying 10 gallons out of my 5-gallon nozzle so I could drive painfully slow as everything was flapping up and down on this unbelievably rough field. So there's little benefits that way. I didn't want to buy a set of nozzles or do something different for 1 quarter, but yeah, speed just changing your speed is huge.
Yeah, and it's, there's this funny relationship in the pressure and flow world where if you want to, double your flow, let's say, you have to quadruple your spray pressure. It's a square root relationship, and that always messes people up. So a small change in speed results in a relatively large change in pressure. And that's why we say use pressure gauge as your speedometer, and just watch it. Make sure you're within the bounds of the nozzle. Make sure you know the spray quality within the rough ranges that you've got, and just kind of adjust your speed accordingly. And if you don't like the speed that you're driving because of things like Ian just said, you just simply have to get a different nozzle. I mean, that's really the only way to ensure the quality job. Nozzles are still a bargain. On a 120-foot boom, we've got 72 nozzle bodies. You can get almost any of the top air induction tips for $10 or sometimes less. So yeah, it's money, but it's probably worth it.
One question for you, Tom. I have a quick question for Tom. Pressure is your speedometer. What's your thoughts on having a separate pressure gauge on your boom, or your monitor on whatever sprayer has a pressure gauge? Where is that pressure coming from, and how much pressure change do you see between that and maybe having an external gauge on boom section, something, or farther down in the piping?
Yeah, no, very important. The pressure drop is fairly significant. So the typical pressure sensor is between the pump and the manifold that distributes it to the section, so that whatever section you're spraying, you will have a pressure reading. And so that leaves the sectional control valves, the plumbing to the individual sections, and the individual nozzle bodies and any valves they may have, because PWM valves actually create pressure drop as well. So we have seen 10 and even 15 PSI pressure drops from the gauge to the actual nozzle. Now, measuring that nozzle pressure is not easy, because you can't really just put another pressure sensor in. The products just don't exist, and you'd have to do it for each section, right? So what we're recommending you do is you basically do it manually. You put a gauge on a 1/4-inch NPT cap, and then just read the pressure in the cab and read the simultaneous pressure you're spraying through your whole boom on that nozzle that you've just put the gauge on. Take note of that for a few different pressures and flow rates. Pressure drop will increase the higher flow rate of the boom. And so as long as you know the pressure drop, you can compensate. If you have a 10 PSI pressure drop and you need 50 PSI on the nozzle, spray at 60 and you're good to go.
Okay, guys, we've got a few questions coming in now, so that's good. I'll leave mine for later. I just wanted to note that Fernando in Brazil says we do have similar problems with cleaning sprayers. So great to hear from you, Fernando in Brazil. Awesome. All right, John, question on what are your thoughts on increasing the water rate for spraying contact chemicals like a group 10? Would you agree that spraying more than 10 gallons per acre can be as effective as higher chem rates? So can you keep the chem rate the same, increase water volume, and get even more efficacy?
Yeah, I'm not sure, depending on how much you're increasing the rate, that's kind of an odd one, but absolutely on contacts, usually, you see a group 10 is registered, 10 gallon kind of minimum. We see the minimum values registered quite often on the label. You can apply it more, and actually quite often you do get good results. So not that you have to apply more water volume, but certainly if you have the opportunity on a contact herbicide, water is one of the cheapest things to make that herbicide work better. right? Especially in thick canopy, challenging conditions. Maybe it's dusty, we're having problems getting, the more herbicide that touches the plant, the better the efficacy. So if you do have that opportunity, you can fill a little faster, or I have a couple of fields where there's smaller little pieces of field, but if I'm spraying a group 10, if I fill the spray rate full of water anyway, I can adjust my rate, the herbicide rate stays the same, but I can get a bit more water on, and really it's one tank to drive to this field, spray it anyway. Those kind of opportunities do make a big difference.
Yeah, I view water volume really as an insurance policy. It sort of sets the stage for things that you might want to do. Having a little bit more water gives you the opportunity to do something with droplet size if you have a drift issue. But in terms of the size of the hammer, rate still has a role to play here. We're not going to turn a bad situation with efficacy of Liberty into a good situation just by adding some water. Liberty is notoriously sensitive to all kinds of inputs, including, whether at time of spraying, whether it's sunny when you're spraying, what the moisture regime has been in the past few days and in the future. So rate still is a slightly bigger hammer, but we're already at fairly high rates with Liberty. So it does become, a productivity question and a label question.
Okay, we'll move on. So we got a question from Kurt. Kurt, we're not going to address this one, but I really like it. Well, maybe we'll get a quick 10-second answer from Tom. And I think, Kurt, you're talking about OptiSpray, green on green. How far away are we from that, Tom?
It's commercially available in Australia from Bilberry, a French manufacturer. They're currently able to buy green on green algorithms on Agrifax sprayers that will spray wild radish out of any crop. It's a notoriously bad weed. It's just the one. I mean, it'll do other weeds, but it's about 80% effective at targeting that particular weed. And they consider that to be sufficient. For the rest of the world, we are seeing Amazon unveiling their smart sprayer this year for testing in the field, 120-foot unit. But then it really becomes a question: how good does it have to be commercially successful? 80% for a notoriously bad weed may not be good enough for general purpose.
Okay, so that's so we've got green on brown, which means these optical sprayers can see a green weed growing on a brown field, but the green on green is taking it to a whole other level.
Yeah, green on brown is here. It's working. Get it.
So we've got two questions about water. So Michael asks about using hard water, particularly with glyphosate. Looking for a comment on that, Ian, and then Tom, and then we'll move on to the next water question.
Yeah, hard water and glyphosate's a classic problem, something to be tested, and especially if you're shallow well or a dugout. We've been really dry. Water quality changes quite a bit, especially if you're taking from maybe a dugout or some sort of water system that's changed quite a bit. So checking your water system more than just one, maybe once a year, or if conditions are changing, we might see quite a bit of difference in the water quality. So there are things you can add to your glyphosate, reducing water volume. Like there's a few different things, but again, in some cases, it's easier also to find if you can find a different source of water, especially for some of these really sensitive ones. Quite often we talk about trying to fix it, and there is options to fix it. But if you have an opportunity to find better water, that solves a lot of headaches and takes some of that variability out of it. So testing, maybe you have a different dugout, maybe for glyphosate you have to drive a little farther, but for that one product, that's really key. And once you move into less sensitive products, you can go to something that's a little closer to home or something like that. But building a system where maybe you can get good quality water is key if you can find it.
Yeah, that's true. And sometimes I'll consult with individuals who have 2 or 3 well locations, and they'll say, which is the water I should use? Now, remember, glyphosate is sensitive to hardness at the half liter per rate equivalent at about 350 parts per million total hardness. If you have a higher rate, and a lot of people are using higher rates because glyphosate has historically been quite cheap, then obviously your sensitivity is a little bit less. Aside from water, if you've got water and you're worried about it, definitely the testing, but ammonium sulfate is the adjuvant. I mean, that's what works. It's 210024. That's pure ammonium sulfate. And a 1 to 2% by weight mixture usually solves most water quality issues for glyphosate. What some of my colleagues say, why bother? The best adjuvant for a hard water is more glyphosate. Because you can overcome with rate. It is a concentration dependent thing. But again, it's cost, it's label, it's those kinds of things.
Okay, one more water quality question, and maybe just related again to getting it tested. But So not everyone uses municipal well water. There's dugouts out there. So John asks, sometimes we use nasty looking, smelly dugout water, but it seems to work just fine. It's filtered. But is there anything else they should be concerned about?
Well, maybe I'll just go first. I see Ian hesitating, but typically surface water is not your water quality issue. Surface water is typically soft. It's these old aquifers that have notorious amounts of sodium and calcium and magnesium in them that are the issue, and they're regionally located. They're actually, the location is well known, and people that have hard water know all about it. Surface water, you have to watch particulates, and there's going to be filtered out for the most part, but you have to watch turbidity, and especially after a rainfall event, and then glyphosate, and later in the season maybe Reglone are very, very sensitive to suspended clay. And then you might want to use a flocculating agent. This is aluminum sulfate. It's a powder. It's applied to the dugout about a day or two before, and it actually settles out some of these suspended solids and clarifies the water. That's a good practice if you have turbidity issues.
Okay, we have it doesn't have to be all about weeds. Got a quick question about nozzles for nutrient application. Tom?
So the rise of the specialty nutrients has created some problems for the tank mixing world. That's one thing I want to just talk about. And it basically means you have to jar test using the temperature, using the water that you're going to use, and using the mixing order you're going to use, the temperature of the water. Everything has to be just so, because the compatibility, you just can't predict it with nutrients. Most nutrients are still taken up by roots. I'm not a fertility expert. I'm just parroting what I've heard them say. Most nutrients are still taken up by roots, and therefore streamer nozzles may still be the best way to do that. But some may be taken up by foliar mechanisms, and they can in fact be mixed in that case with some of your pesticides.
Yeah, that might have just been about using the sprayer to apply straight nutrients, maybe not tank mixing. But that reminds me of something, Tom, we talked about earlier, is that this idea of tank mixing in an insecticide to get flea beetles right around the same time that you're trying to get weeds. The timing is probably perfect, but it's quite a bit different in terms of your spray, droplet size, targeting. Can you talk about some of the risks when targeting two quite different scenarios, weeds versus insects?
That's a great question. I mean, Ian, I'm going to leave the scouting to you, and I'm just going to go assuming you've got these things. But most of our post-emergent flea beetle sprays are insecticide group 3A. They're pyrethroids. Pyrethroids act as a stomach poison, which means they hit the foliage, and then they're absorbed, and the insects have to eat the targeted foliage and their contact. In other words, the droplet hits the insect dies. For both of those situations, you need small drops to work. The likelihood of a flea beetle ingesting the spot that the droplet hit is low, and it gets higher and higher the smaller the drops are and the more drops there are. And the same can be said for hitting that flea beetle itself. So if you're doing a low drift air induction spray for drift control with your herbicide on a windy day and you think you're going to get flea beetles, you might not.
Ian, do you want to jump in? Anything to add there?
Yeah, so there's obviously challenges at rolling that in. There's efficiencies, but there's also challenges doing that. I think that the key thing is noticing that there are difficulties and making sure we hit thresholds. I like the idea of spraying early for weeds. That's a really key point that I think we still seem to miss, that really early window, and that's a key point. But if we are spraying for flea beetles, we're trying to throw that in. I don't want to throw that into the tank mix, right? We got to make sure we hit threshold on it and realize that there are differences. There might actually be enough difference if we haven't quite hit threshold, but we want to spray for weeds, or those that two applications might actually be more efficient. Obviously, there's cases where it's easy to do it 2 in 1. We just have to realize that it's hard to optimize both. There will be some. So is that early weeds? And again, it depends on the weed pressure. If we have a lot of flea beetles, we've hit threshold easily, but there's some weeds. I don't mind the idea of still cleaning up those early weeds. Those are the most competitive ones, but realizing that we might want to optimize for one or the other That's just a key thing. It's not a complete win-win.
Yep. Okay, so we've got some questions about specific products. We got about 5 minutes left, so I want to save at least a minute, maybe 2 minutes for each of you. So let's take 2 more questions. So this is, I'll pick one. Any things to look out for when using an induction system like gives a Raven sidekick as the example here, but who wants to start with that? Just any lookouts with an induction system.
So I think the attendee means an injection system. The Raven Sidekick is a pump that injects chemical in the undiluted form from a small reservoir on the sprayer directly into the spray line. So you can actually then just hold water in your tank and then just have the turbulence in the spray boom just before exiting the nozzle actually do the mixing. And that works quite well. That Sidekick is a mature technology. It has an excellent reputation in the market. It's offered by many of the OEM as an OEM piece of equipment, many of the manufacturers. I don't have any real history with it because injection is still not done very widely. But I have certainly not been aware of any special concerns. The main issue really for it is that it doesn't handle the dry formulations without creating a slurry, and slurries need agitation. And so that remains an issue as dry products really are still quite prevalent in our world.
Ian, do you have anything to add there?
No, I don't have a lot of experience with it. Anytime you can limit where the chemical is in your sprayer, that seems like a great idea. But yeah, no, not something I've worked with.
Well, so I'll stick with you for this one last question then, Ian. And I know, Tom, you can talk about this too, but so this is about a John Deere stainless steel boom. I'm assuming it's not just a John Deere issue, but how can I, this is the question, how can I get the chemical out that gets caught on the lip on the end of the pipe? Ian? Any
the
tips
lip
there?
on the end
Well,
of the pipe,
yeah,
like the end nozzle.
The very end, yeah. So there's that little gap or a little extension of the pipe at the end.
And that's classic when you see, especially Group 2 injuries, you see the little trailing. You can tell when the boom section's cut on and off, and you'll see these kind of V's in the field. So I know Hypro has an end nozzle system that kind of deals with some of that. That's the fancy option. The other option, which my sprayer has, is cheap ball valves at the end of each nozzle, at the end of each one. And I crack those every time. I have them on both ends. They're usually the boom has threads on the end. Screw on a cheap ball valve, flush it out. Pretty much that solves that issue for me. It's a fairly cheap and easy. You have to get out of the sprayer when you're rinsing. You have to go along, crack them all, and flip them all on and off. But it's a pretty easy way to sort that out. So that solves most of the issues. The one thing I would note with that is if you do have products that are like tank mixes that are a little bit complicated, you've done a jar test, it's okay. You spray, you agitate. But if that sprayer sits, sometimes flushing those out in between after the sprayer sit, maybe you're not switching chemicals, but just making sure. It's actually also nice to actually once in a while I crack one and just look in there. Is there any goo sitting in there? Is there anything I should be worried about as I come to rinsing? Or I got rained out. The sprayer had to sit with an unfortunate tank mix a little bit. It's actually not a bad way to check those ahead of time so you don't put whatever things have maybe settled out and then throw those through nozzles or have other issues. But ball valves are the cheapest and easiest way to go.
And of course, the recirculating boom is a winter project I mentioned that would actually solve the problem because you never have a dead end anymore and you can actually flush it with water without spraying.
Say if you had a checklist of things that you wanted to get retrofitted on a sprayer, are most of the supply companies, like the sprayer companies, pretty good? If you took it in there in the winter and said, hey, I want this, and this added, can you take care of that for me? Is that a pretty simple process?
Right now, no. I mean, right now we're talking about shop projects on the farm. They're starting to retrofit recirculating booms. There's kits available, but they're still DIY projects. We're hopefully going to see some more recirculating booms at the OEM level. But for now, it's still a home project. You can get, if you still have plastic booms, you can replace them with steel booms and those kinds of things at the dealer. But for the most part, there is huge opportunity for improving your sprayer on a winter project.
Okay, we're going to have to sign off. So we'll get you guys to do your last top threes. We didn't get to all the questions, but I suspect if people have burning questions, Tom is at nozzle_guy on Twitter. I'm sure he'll take all your questions. Ian, you're at EPCCC, is that it?
Yep.
Okay, EPPCCC on Twitter.
Yeah.
You can also throw in at Canola Growers. That's MCGA's Twitter address, and we'll get all these questions answered that way. But let's go, Ian, we'll go to you first. What are your final 3 points? Oh, good. Hang on. Courtney Vischer just noted the CCA code. So we'll get Karina to flash that up right away. Perfect. There it is. Good. Thanks for the reminder. Okay, Ian, while that's up there, what are your final 3?
Make sure your sprayer is clean. It's hard to fix out if it's not clean. So make sure it's clean between products, especially before spraying Liberty. Scout your fields. Nothing replaces checking them. What weeds are in your field? Anything new? Rate, staging? Do I got to add a tank mix partner? These are all things we can correct today and tomorrow so we can spray the next day. So make sure we know what's in the field, how to spray it, and then just double check that we're spraying on the label. Timing, rates, these are all good adjustments to make, but make sure we're on the label so we don't have problems when we go to sell that crop at the end of the season.
Great, Ian. Tom.
Yeah, I have 3 main points. The first one is to know the spray quality that you need for the herbicides and insecticides you're planning to spray, and make sure you've got the nozzles that can do that, and you know how to do it with pressure if necessary. Number 2 is take the time to do some time accounting. Measure the time it takes you to do certain tasks and imagine that they took less time. That will define your priority list for your winter projects, because there's lots of room for improvement. Remember, you don't have to be in a hurry to benefit from more productive spraying time. It's just rare occasions it'll let you get the job done before the bad weather hits. And finally, do consider getting an ultra coarse nozzle to get you out of a bind with a field that must be sprayed and the winds are a little bit too high. You can spray it with an ultra coarse nozzle. You may lose some coverage, yes, but you will get the job done in an environmentally friendly way.
That was excellent. Thanks, guys. It was my pleasure to be part of this. It's always fun to ask questions of experts like you two. Just a quick recap, sprayers101.com. You can get all of Tom's, you can basically dumps his whole brain onto that website. So there's lots of good stuff there. From the Canola Council's perspective, we've got the Canola Encyclopedia.ca and then canolawatch.org. And at Canola Watch, there's a question, or there's an article called Spraying in Tough Conditions, and it leads to lots of stuff, including cold and whatnot. That's it for me. I'm going to turn this over to Karina to sign off. Thanks again, everybody. Lots of great participation.
Yes, just want to echo those comments. Thank you, everybody, for participating this morning, and a special thanks to Jay, Tom, and Ian for all of this info in the last hour, and wish everybody the best in spring season coming up. Thanks for joining us.